First you draw a circle, then you dot the i's, add a great big smile and presto, it's... Going by the extremely simple appearance of a pink sphere with an almost infectious grin on his face, Kirby enjoys a valuable popularity among children as well as adults, despite coming across as simplistic as most of his games tend to be. One reason for sure is the uncomplicated yet brilliant character design, which can be easily copied by a first grade student, and even if not, it's still a Kirby. Of course, this is only one part of the mass appeal, so it wouldn't feel quite right if the games don't convey the same elementary in an effort to create an experience for everyone at a time where games felt inclined to lean on the challenging side. Kirby Streamlined takes on the role of the starting page for many young players and still carries this title like no other franchise ever could. Kirby Streamlined is the debut of the, in this game, white ball and released back in 1992 for the Game Boy to great success. While the series' accessible difficulties seem to merge into today's zeitgeist of further streamlining experiences, it wasn't as common as now to prioritize veterans as well as beginners simultaneously. What has changed, however, is in which way this approachability has evolved over the years in the industry, from teaching by doing to further tutorializing with dull explanations. It's rare to see a game fully commit to what the original Kirby Streamlined tried to convey and create something fully wrapped by the theme of accessibility in gameplay, style and music. Maybe it's because of this committing spirit that is still embodied even in the most modern Kirby game why I cherish this franchise so much, and, in my belief, is still not enough appreciated despite having such a following. This is why we're going to retrospect every Kirby game in chronological order in great detail and determine the magic of a simple smiling sphere shaped like a friend. Unlike many other Nintendo series, Kirby started as a handheld hero and was therefore adjusted to the limiting power the Game Boy provided. Keeping this natural simplicity in mind, Kirby is only capable of straightforward moves, with his characteristic skill of copying the enemy's ability not even implemented. Because of this, the only means to properly attack or dodge is to either inhale foes and spit them out, or use the extra air to fly. I particularly like the short momentum Kirby needs to inflate himself. It's hard to explain without actually playing it, but it can be seen when performed in the air. With an ability like this, it might be tempting to just fly over the whole level, circumventing every obstacle with ease, but it would be the same as stating it's possible to train a character to its maximum level at the beginning area in an RPG. Whatever the case may be, the game is completely aware of this eventuality and tries to limit that behavior as much as possible. Flying enemies are immediately introduced to teach the player that the sky is no means to bypass the level design, and even if it potentially is, the game isn't structured like a traditional 2D platformer after all. Instead of jumping through one connected section with a clear beginning and end, Dreamland's levels are divided into multiple segments. With this approach, the developers could bring in as much variety in terms of settings as possible in a game with only 5 levels. What's even more impressive is how they managed to organize these themes logically with natural transitions between them. Level 3, for example, ends in the sky and level 4 continues from there, only to bring Kirby finally to King Dedede's castle at the top of a mountain. This approach also ensures checkpoints at the start of each section and holds back frustration without becoming too hand-holding. Nonetheless, deaths are unavoidable in a game created to be the first one for beginners, so whenever failure happens, the player needs to learn from it. Normally, the level of a 2D platformer needs to teach its mechanics naturally by its design, instead of telling directly. In the end, courses are just a medium designed around the protagonist's controls and quirks. You cannot put Mario in a Sonic level and expect it to work. First impressions are everything, which is why it's so important to make the fundamentals of a game clear right from the start. Before it's even necessary to make the first jump, 2 Waddle Dees approach Kirby to teach him that first, it's possible to inhale an enemy, and second, spit him out in order to damage another. Even if players doesn't understand this concept immediately, the worst thing to happen is to take damage, demonstrating how contact also beats foes, with the second one being defeated by invincibility frames. This is a huge contrast to similar games at that time, where life energy was limited and enemies simply walked straight through the protagonist, forcing him to retreat or run at once. Kirby, on the other hand, makes sure to teach the player 2 necessary information no matter how the first confrontation might end, either learning how to inhale and shoot, or observe the enemies and Kirby's situation after taking a hit. After that, a high wall blocks the way, and instead of putting an information box in there telling the player what to do, he is forced to think about the situation situation and use the knowledge he just learned. Kirby can inhale, therefore he must be able to keep the air inside and blow himself up like a balloon. It's the natural conclusion of what just happened before and makes perfect sense regarding how both abilities, attacking and flying, are based on the same action, namely inhaling. But this is not the only case where mechanics are taught through action. Level 3 shows the player how Kirby is able to destroy enemies if landing from a higher place, which is implied by the special falling animation. Again, the situation by itself is less breathtaking than the actual concept of designing a level around the idea of the interactivity of the medium instead of using words. Generally, there's nothing wrong in doing this, especially if it's optional, but Dreamland must expect the player to not be able to even read and understand its inexperienced target group from the first moment the game starts. Jumping on a moving foe precisely is intimidating, so allowing Kirby to perform a special ability while being on the ground in front of him was necessary to ensure safety. A child might make the first jump, but there's no guarantee he will do the second one. With more than 1 or 2 life points, mistakes are forgiven much more mercifully at a time where health was often linked to items. The only instance when instant death can happen are bottomless pits, which happen to appear much less commonly thanks to the powerful ability to fly endlessly. Every power holds a weakness though, and with an advantage like this, there had to be challenges implemented around it. Typically, spikes and dangerous surfaces take up that role and bring in dexterity exercises to compensate the missing platforming sections. Usually I refrain from comparing games to titles being released afterwards, but it's actually quite surprising to see how flying as a base for challenges was scaled back more and more as the series continued, which gives Dreamland even today a unique trait. Maybe it's because of the focus on copy abilities, but every move has the potential for an interesting challenge and should therefore not be left untouched. Above all, with only 5 levels, there's only so much time to captivate the player, which is why most of them are built with multiple ways that often either lead to dead ends with health items or optional passages. This is foreshadowed as well, as players will learn quickly that not every door will lead to their goal, but still holds an item as a reward for exploring. Level 2 builds on that idea and consists of several corridors with different sections. Usually a labyrinth-style level could easily be the most annoying course in the game, but most of the passages are repeatedly just detours connected by the same goal. It doesn't matter which path taken, as long as the destiny is reached with relative ease, it shouldn't pose a problem to indirectly stretch out the short playtime a little more. After all, players are encouraged to play through the game more than one time, and with every way that is not taken, there's another excuse to jump and run through Dreamland again. Fortunately, the game understands how to equalize its merits and is constructed with the right balance of complexity and linearity. While level 1 is quite straightforward in its approach, level 2 is far more elaborated, whereas level 3 orientates itself more on the simple nature again. This complementary harmony of level design not only avoids monotony in the structure of the game, but lessens the stress to think from the player's side as well. It can be exhausting to go through 5 complex levels with multiple ways in a row, so it's no coincidence why the game is structured like that in the first place. Since there are rarely, if any, challenges centered around platforming, the difficulty must come from exploration and the proper navigation through a level. It would have been easy to fly over every obstacle in a one corridor course, so enemies have to fulfill the role of obstacles instead. The very first level introduces a plethora of different enemy types and only winds that number to an extent incomparable to most games at that time. For reference, the first Kirby game released back in 1992 has more enemy types than Breath of the Wild, for example, which is totally comparable and makes Kirby the better game. The sheer number was only possible thanks to some clever adjustments in the design department. Waddle-doos are an integral part of the franchise, although they are just a product of clever tweaks to set them apart from simple waddle-dees. The same goes for bosses like Wispy Woods or Krakow, which are so iconic it's hard to imagine they were designed with the limitations of the Game Boy in mind. Necessity is the mother of invention, and despite the fact that this restriction could easily lead to obvious unpleasant recycling of assets, it becomes much less apparent if presented wisely. Saving time, memory and space is a key problem every developer faces, especially during the Game Boy era, so simply swapping faces in order to maintain visual diversity might seem plain at first sight, but is only a matter of execution. Waddle-doos are not simply waddle-dees with one big eye, but behave differently and shoot lasers to make them even more distinct. distinct. It looks the same initially, yet retains a certain surprise factor when met, which is only possible because it shares similarities in design. To no one's surprise, the final boss keeps the most resources for himself and outshines every regular enemy and boss in terms of complexity and animation. While this is only to be expected for the last battle, it becomes even more ironic that an egocentric character like DDD claims nearly all the hardware power for himself. But then again, maybe it's not so reprehensible considering how this is the first and only time to this day that DDD is the true and only final boss of a Kirby game. As a result, the fight plays out as the ultimate test of everything learned so far and requires the proper use of flying, attacking and knowing when to retreat. The effort of the final doesn't only pay off in the fight itself though, as DDD expresses way more character than most enemies in the game. Charging at Kirby only to trip on his own feet is the perfect mix of a proper attack while portraying the type of person, or penguin, the player is facing. Needless to say, it clashes with the overall self-convinced portrayal of DDD, which is shown during the whole battle in the background and portrayed with some attacks he performs. If seen through this view, complexity in a character's model can certainly help to either emphasize the tone or dynamic of a battle. Even though this might be true, Kirby himself is a participant of the last clash as well and shows the other side of the same coin. His design could not be simpler, yet gives off more charisma than far more detailed protagonists in other games ever could. This is also the reason what moved him up from a mere placeholder character to the main hero of the game. The developers felt the same and put in as many charming animations and details as possible to give Kirby the childlike character that is mirrored in the target audience. Short sequences before each level further add to what was already regarded as genuinely delightful, and details like the fire power-up getting extinguished when coming in contact with water or a little dance while pausing for too long are just signs of a team that deeply cares for what they develop. Give a musician one instrument and he becomes a master of it, but offer him a whole orchestra of all kinds of instruments and he might get overwhelmed. Sometimes restrictions are nothing reprehensible, and while colors would certainly help to bypass the famous white depiction of Kirby on the Western game boxes, it forced the creative staff to think outside the circle and put more effort into animations, behaviors and everything that is independent of colors. The same goes for the music, which had to work with similar limitations as the visual department. Maybe it's also for this reason why most of the tracks are as memorable as they are today and are still remixed 30 years later. There's only so much musical atmosphere a Game Boy can provide, so instead, catchy melodies have to constitute for the lack of orchestration. Again, the circumstances define the conditions, and while the level design, controls and enemies all share an equal type of simplicity, the music follows the very same pattern. Most of the music pieces loop after just a few seconds and mirror the elementariness of the gameplay. King DDD's theme is so iconic at this point that it's hard to imagine that this original track is only half as long as today's renditions. This is not to say that the audio is amateurish by any means, but for lack of better term, it's extremely aware of the capabilities the little handheld offers. The reason why King DDD's theme sounds so climactic despite being such a goofy enemy, because it's not a theme representing him as a character, but the raid on his castle that is accompanied by a rather deterministic sequence in place of a silly one like all the others. By this point, the player has already learned all the skills to face off the final fight and is therefore not a beginner anymore. This is also why I love the feature of games going through a boss rush before the climax. It might appear as an ultimate challenge at first, however, I always treated it as a way to showcase how strong the protagonist became. Newcomers may have their problems with Wispy Woods or the twins at the start, but will now regard them as no more than regular enemies. What seems like a perfect way to close off the adventure is only the start of a much greater challenge. When beating Kirby Streamlined for the first time, the reward is nothing but an additional hard mode unlocked with a specific button combination. Initially, this implementation appears to be rather contradicting to the beginner-friendly principle of Kirby. However, being beginner-friendly isn't only about introducing someone to an unfamiliar topic, it's about initiating the groundwork for the future. Putting on training wheels for a child's bike serves the purpose of learning the basics in order to become, one day, independent. Training wheels are not meant to hide the kid from the actual skill, so it only makes sense to present inexperienced players a mode where they can take away these wheels. Back then, a hard mode wasn't as common as now, so there were no expectations to what was actually changed. When comparing with today's games, adjustments often only apply either to the player's character, with reduced health for example, or stronger enemies in general. The core level design and gameplay stay the same, because it's hard to expect a completely rearranged experience. Dreamland, in contrast, strikes a balance in between and does the exact same thing the first regular playthrough already displayed. Although the player thinks he knows how the game ticks by now, it's the first Waddle Dees again that will teach him a lesson. Instead of running towards Kirby to inhale them, they instead jump, showing a much more unpredictable behavior in comparison to before. This isn't the only place where expectations are put to the test though. When falling through a small gap in level 3, an ordinary foe is replaced with an invincible Gordo, almost guaranteeing damage. One might call the situation unfair, but the game already gave enough chances to expect something dirty. The player knows there's going to be something because of the first playthrough, and the Waddle Dees at the beginning demonstrate that it's not advisable to rely on set expectations. Seemingly empty rooms are now filled with all sorts of obstacles, and healing items are replaced with inferior counterparts. Level sections that seemed weirdly uneventful at first make now total sense in consideration of how they were created with the hard mode in mind. But probably the best part about all of this is the hard mode being truly difficult. Bosses like Krakow Jr. seem totally unfair initially, yet are completely feasible with the right strategy. It's not about just simply beating the opponent anymore, but understanding movement and finding holes in their attacks. Lives get an entirely new value, and although checkpoints function the same, a game over becomes much more probable. It's here where the missing saving system shows its drawback. While the regular campaign is fairly easy and therefore quick to beat, the hard mode can take its time and, in the worst case, frustrates the player at certain moments to stop playing. Maybe this was a deliberate choice to mirror the arcade-like structure of bringing people back by giving them no opportunity to save, but overall it just clashes with the intended game design and makes the circumstances more difficult than the actual game. Once again, all of this culminates in the final level, where it's necessary to beat all the bosses in a row without getting a single game over. Being the Kirby pro that I am, this challenge wasn't as demanding as you might think, but it's understandable if some players, even the skilled ones, hit an unbreakable wall in this game for children. Anyway, with a quest like that, a reward beyond the satisfying feeling of overcoming the odds would likely be too much. However, one final code unlocks a configuration menu with options to alter the health points and listen to the soundtrack. It's interesting to see how Dreamland can turn from one of the most beginner-friendly games for the handheld to an extremely hard experience only with a few adjustments. This duality might come off as a shock, but is actually just an echo that still rings through the franchise. If you have listened closely throughout this review, you may have noticed a certain pattern, especially if you played modern Kirby titles. Every idea that is introduced in this game acts as a basement for the future of the franchise and is still used, albeit with changes. The final level resembles the arena in modern Kirby. Transitory power-ups are precursors of copy abilities. The hard mode and shooting passages are still part of every modern Kirby game. The twins are references to past titles, and the focus on exploration instead of platforming should lead the direction of some titles. There are probably many more I haven't even noticed, but it's rare to see a series be so conscious and faithful about its legacy despite running for so long. Maybe it's for this reason why Kirby still exists, but it would be unfair to judge the game based on the future it had no idea of. After all, this is just the beginning, and with countless adventures on the horizon, this video should take an example of the game and maybe not overstay its welcome. Kirby's Dreamland casts a long shadow over the series and defined the direction of the franchise to this day. In consideration of high accessibility, everything seems to be built with that philosophy in mind, while respecting the player's intelligence no matter the age. Be it the game's length, level design or the controls, Dreamland fits on the small screen of a Game Boy perfectly and encapsulates the goal of a starting point more elegantly than most unskippable text boxes ever could. It's not about holding your hands, but rather giving you a little nudge and watching your back as you make your first step into something that seemed intimidating at first, yet surmountable, which is proven by the inclusion of an actual challenging hard mode. The sky is the limit, and although it takes time to learn certain things, this review of Kirby Streamlined is probably just as long as it takes you to beat the game. Maybe that's kinda ironic regarding how I just told you about all of this, but perhaps it's also a sign that you should better spend this time playing Kirby Streamlined and make a picture for yourself. The first game was a great success, so of course there needs to be an even better successor for the NES.
Kirby coming on a home console? I hope it will be longer.
This time enemies have to watch out, as Kirby can now copy their abilities and is more flexible than ever.
Then again, maybe that's just because the game has colors now?